Listening in and watching and thinking about these developments this afternoon, former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Mr. President, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to join you. It's a happy occasion, I think, for our country.
Mr. President, what did it?
Well, what did it was just opening up some kind of direct communication with Kim Il-sung. As Wolf pointed out a few minutes ago, what the North Koreans were waiting for was some treatment of their exalted leader with respect and a direct communication with the only person in the world that could possibly have made any concessions in that very unique and strange society that we witnessed only a few days ago. There is an incredible reverence and exaltation of President Kim Il-sung. And none of his subordinates can possibly make any sort of concessions or new ideas into effect except him. So I felt very deeply that this was a crisis, and I also had a long-standing invitation from him since early 1991. So I just decided that it would be better for me to go over there. I think he was quite ready. I didn't have to argue with him. When I outlined the specific points that I had been informed in Washington were the administration's position, I presented them to him, and with very little equivocation, he agreed.
President Carter, it's Judy Woodruff here with Bernie Shaw in Washington. The administration, the Clinton administration, seemed skeptical of this when you came back from North Korea. President Clinton himself did not even meet with you personally. We know he was at Camp David when you were in Washington. Did you feel there was some resistance to what you had accomplished over there?
Well, Judy, I think it's all roses now. I have known for the last year or more that there were top officials, particularly in the State Department, that did not want me to go. And so I notified President Clinton while he was in Europe, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Normandy, that I was strongly inclined to go. And he came back almost immediately and in effect authorized my trip. But I've known that there were people in Washington who were skeptical about any direct dealing with the North Koreans. They were already condemned as outlaws. Kim Il-sung was already condemned as a criminal. And I feel that I got adequate approval and support from President Clinton. And I appreciate his faith in me, even under very difficult circumstances. And it was kind of like a miracle and almost an incredible statement that Kim Il-sung gave me to in response to my proposals. And it was hard to believe. And I know that those in Washington have never seen him or talked to any of his top officials. Nobody, very few people, only 5 or 6 Americans have ever visited North Korea since the war was over, that to them it would be very difficult to believe. So I have no criticism of anyone. The last point I'd like to make is that everything that I proposed in North Korea was exactly what President Clinton had wanted. It was his policy, and in a totally unofficial way representing the Carter Center. I just presented his policy without any distortions to it.
Mr. President, I'm astounded by a few things you just said, and this question might come out rather garbled because my mind is still scrambling trying to take in what you've just said. But the ramifications of what you said are really horrific. What you're saying, in effect, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but what you're saying, what I hear you saying is that if you had not gone to Pyongyang, the gulf between that capital and Washington, D.C. would still be very great. A top administration official told us, off the record or on background, not off the record, that we don't know what the North Koreans want. Were we really that close?
Well, I don't have any way to know what would have happened if we hadn't had this direct contact with Kim Il-sung. It's a serious mistake, I think, to be in a critical mood now. There was an impending crisis. The administration has said that there was no crisis. I thought there was an impending crisis, and now the crisis is over. But I've had full support from President Clinton and from Vice President Al Gore from the very beginning of my initiative. And I was thoroughly briefed for, I would say, in all 6 or 7 hours by experts on the nuclear program and all of the background that had been, that preceded my visit. I got a clear support from them and when I arrived in South Korea and when I got back. So I think it's been a very wonderful relationship that I've had with the people in our country that could actually make the decision, that is President Clinton, and the person in North Korea who could actually make a decision, that was President Kim Il-sung.
Listening by telephone is a correspondent whom you know, our Beijing Bureau Chief Mike Chinoy. He's in Shanghai, and he has a question for you.
Mr. President, when you finished your meeting in Pyongyang last week with North Korea's first vice foreign minister, the man who normally talks with the chief U.S. negotiator, Robert Gallucci, as you came down the stairs, I heard you say, now I know why Bob Gallucci has such a hard time with you. You're a tough negotiator. In earlier sessions between North Korean and U.S. officials, the U.S. has shown a lot of exasperation at what they saw as North Korean stonewalling and nickeling and diming and brinksmanship. Is there anything in this new situation that leads you to think that the next round might go more smoothly, or is it likely that when they sit down you'll get back to this same pattern of negotiations that has been so frustrating for the U.S. in the past?
Well, Mike, on the long boat trip that I had with President Kim Il-sung and his wife and my wife, Rosalind, Vice Minister Kong was on the trip. He was the only one that was brought into the little private stateroom where we had lunch together and enjoyed the river trip. And it's obvious that he was surprised at the level of welcome that President Kim Il-sung gave to me. He told Marion Creekmore, who was traveling with me, as you know, that usually Kim Il-sung only spent 20 minutes with any foreign visitor, even distinguished visitors from China or other places. The morning before, when I got my agreement, which has now been confirmed with President Kim Il-sung, that afternoon I spent several hours with Vice Minister Kong, and he was still kind of hard-lined with me. But every time he was, I said, well, are you departing from the policy of your great leader? Do you have one policy and President Kim Il-sung has a different policy? He said, oh no. What President told you this morning is obviously binding on me. But on 3 or 4 occasions during that conversation with Minister Kong, he was tending to go back and revive, you know, the arguments that he had had with Bob Gallucci instead of honoring what he had just heard that morning, his great leader, as he calls him, say.
President Carter, this is Judy Woodruff again in Washington. Are you absolutely persuaded that the North Koreans are going to honor this agreement, that while these talks are going on, that it's not just a matter of buying time on the part of the North Koreans, that they will not secretly pursue the program they were pursuing earlier, nuclear program?
Judy, I'm convinced, but, you know, I said this when I got back from North Korea, and people said that I was naive or gullible and so forth. I don't think I was. In my opinion, this was one of those perfect agreements where both sides won and got what they wanted. And there were nobody blinked, nobody had to yield. What the North Koreans have gotten, potentially, if this all works out, of course, is recognition as a respected nation. They've got open dialogue with the United States of America. They've got the end of a threat of universal condemnation of their country as an outlaw nation and of their leader as a criminal. They've got the assurance that the United States will support their effort to get light water reactor technology, which will replace this old, very dangerous graphite-moderated reactor technology. They know very clearly, though, that the United States cannot give either funding or the equipment directly from our nation, but we can support it from Switzerland or from other sources. And also, one of the things that's been overlooked is perhaps even more significant, and that is that on this interesting boat ride, President Kim Il-sung agreed to a summit talk with the president of South Korea. Since then, I've been on the phone with South Korea and also on the phone with the North Koreans, helping to make sure that both sides did agree to have vice prime minister level talks on the 28th of this month, which is just a few days in the future. They both agreed to this. So I think it's a very good thing that Kim Il-sung has done. He's lost his major allies in Russia. China has recognized South Korea, so this gives him an opening to the outside world that he wouldn't have otherwise had. So both sides got exactly what they wanted, in my opinion.
President Carter, this is Ralph Begleiter in Washington. Also, I'd like to ask you a question as well. I've seen a copy of the letter that Ambassador Gallucci got from Minister Kung, and I think you've also seen that as well. Not only does it make the promises that you've just outlined a moment ago, but it also talks about complying with the full nuclear non-proliferation treaty and with all of the safeguards of the IAEA, from which the North Koreans just withdrew a few days ago. My question to you is, essentially, have the U.S. and North Korea written off the idea of going back and trying to figure out what happened in the past with the nuclear fuel and whether any of it was processed into bomb-making material and so on, and have they essentially agreed, let's just start from here with talks, we'll work on the future, and maybe we'll get around to the past later on, but we're not going to insist on that issue now? Is that part of the deal here?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for what our government policy will be, but as far as I'm concerned, I didn't write off anything. In fact, I discussed quite in detail with President Kim Il-sung the total transparency of their nuclear program. And when I met that same afternoon with Vice Minister Kung, I used the words "from its inception." So my presumption is that all of the IAEA safeguards will be honored. I'm fairly familiar with the nuclear program and with the technical aspects involved, and I've gotten a review of my old Rickover days in the last few days. But this was something that I agreed with the North Korean leader that they would do, and I think in this letter, which I got about 3 o'clock this afternoon, by the way, he confirmed that they want full safeguards implemented, no hesitation and no equivocation. But what will happen in the future in the third round of talks, I can't predict that.
Mr. President, from the Carter Center, you do a lot of reflecting down there in Atlanta, and you obviously are a citizen of the world, and I'd like you to think for a moment as you respond to this question at some length, if you choose to. What lessons are to be learned from this episode? I have in mind relations between nations, one nation isolated from the world tensions, world peace. What basic lessons, in your judgment, are to be learned from this episode?
Well, very briefly, I think the most important lesson is that we should not ever avoid direct talks, direct conversations, direct discussions and negotiations with the main person in a despised or misunderstood or condemned society who can actually resolve the issue. And we went through this for 10 years when nobody in our government would meet or talk to Yasser Arafat. The Norwegians did, and they were the ones that brought the peace agreement last summer. We had the same thing for a while. We withdrew our ambassador from Syria. Nobody would talk to President Assad. We had the same problem in Mogadishu when no one would talk to General Aidid. When I went down to help hold the elections in Nicaragua, although we had an ambassador in Managua, he was instructed from Washington, do not have any conversation whatsoever with anyone in the government of the Sandinistas. So I think this is the basic lesson to be learned. And when it's impossible, maybe diplomatically or very difficult diplomatically, to have these kind of talks, that's really what the Carter Center does. I don't have any restraint on me, and all of these cases that I've just described to you, I have very easy conversations with the leaders who are despised or condemned or looked upon as unsavory people. I think this is something that is a legitimate role for an organization like the Carter Center. And the fact that I have been President of the United States obviously gives me an entree into these circles of discussion that the average citizen would not have.
Mike Shinoy.
President?
Mike?
Yes, Mr. President, two quick questions. First of all, do you think, on the basis of what you just said, that President Clinton ought to consider some form of direct personal communication with President Kim Il-sung? And secondly, you say you've been in touch with the North Koreans by phone, but as you know, they watch CNN. Do you have any particular message directly to them in the aftermath of this latest dramatic step forward?
Well, after I got this, a copy of this report 2 or 3 hours ago, I've already sent a letter to President Kim Il-sung, thanking him for his forthcoming confirmation of the agreement that he made with me officially to the U.S. government now, and offering, as I have before to him, that if there is a problem or a breakdown in communication or misunderstanding about what he actually told me, that I would be available to help resolve the problem. The last couple of days, I had a request from the South Koreans to encourage the North Koreans to agree to this preparatory talk for the summit meeting, and I complied with their request. And of course, I think without my, I'm not saying that I was the one that caused it, but without my maybe needing to do so, it was done, and President Kim Il-sung has indeed now arranged that summit meeting. So I think that even between South Korea and North Korea, there is a very difficult ability to communicate directly. There's never been any sort of direct talks or direct messages between Kim Young-sam in Seoul and his predecessors and Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. So if I can provide that sort of connection, you know, through the Carter Center, I've offered to do so, but I would rather them do it themselves.
President Carter, Judy Woodruff again in Washington. We're playing a bit of ping pong here because there's so many of us who want to talk to you and ask you about this. I'm curious about something, and that is, why do you think the Clinton administration was either misreading the signals from North Korea so badly, or were just not willing to do what you've just described at length here, and that is engage in dialogue, in a conversation with the North Koreans in a way to cut through this impasse?
Well, Judy, there was really no evidence in advance that we would have this forthcoming response from President Kim Il-sung. On the contrary, when there had been good faith talks from the American perspective, the North Koreans had done some very strange and unpredictable things, threatening to eject the inspectors, threatening to disconnect the surveillance equipment, unloading the reactor precipitously, making very harsh statements on their own side. And those kind of confrontational elements tend to escalate. Each one grows on itself, and from the North Korean perspective, they were right when they explained to me why they did certain things like unload the reactor. It sounds very reasonable from their perspective. They also said that as it unloaded the reactor, which was 6 months overdue, I don't think anyone denies that in their opinion then and now, the IAEA inspectors can indeed reconstruct the history of that reactor from the fuel rods as they presently exist. The IAEA inspectors disagree with that. It's an honest difference of opinion, I believe, but those are the kind of things that build up such an obstacle and an element of distrust and even fear on both sides that no one wants to break the ice and actually talk to the guy who can make a decision. And that's where, you know, our center in Atlanta provides some avenues of communication.
President Carter, it's Ralph again in Washington. President Clinton called this an important step forward. He called it a very positive development, didn't use the phrase breakthrough at all, but he did say that in the negotiations that will begin around July 6th or July 8th between the United States and North Korea directly in Geneva, that essentially all issues would be on the table. He mentioned security, political, economic issues. Do you think this is a moment in which the United States and North Korea will begin to address all of those issues and will deal with things such as MIAs from the war, economic cooperation, provision of nuclear equipment? Will they get out of the box of dealing only with this nuclear issue?
That's obviously the potential, and it's what I hope will materialize. It depends, I think, on a step-by-step building up of confidence and a testing of the waters as they go toward those ultimate goals. One of those items, by the way, is already committed, totally separate from the nuclear issue, and that is the retrieval of the remains of at least 3,000 American soldiers who were buried in North Korea. I brought this up with President Kim Il-sung on the boat ride that I had with him that afternoon. Told him that this was not something that was being demanded, but it was something that would send a clear signal of good faith and goodwill toward the American people. Reminded him of the horrible argument we'd had with Vietnam for so long, and urged him to do it. He was quite reluctant to do it. His wife was there with all of us, and she encouraged him to take that step. And eventually he said, okay, it will be done. The essence of it, I don't want to take too much time on this, is that those soldiers were buried by us when we occupied the North Korean territory. And we know exactly where they are within a square yard. And what has not been permitted in the past, which he has now agreed to do, is to let an American team with our 1952 map go in with a North Korean team and extract the remains of individual soldiers because we know who they are and exactly where they're buried. That's a very good thing. And I think if that can be carried out, it would be another major step forward. The summit meeting between the North and South Korean leaders is another element. The North Koreans are not on their knees begging for economic aid from the United States, and they're not begging that the United States have diplomatic relations. They look upon themselves as a proud and respected and sovereign nation who would like to have these relationships on a mutually respectful basis because they think it would be better for the United States to have normal relations with North Korea, and it would be better for North Korea to have normal relations with the United States. But they don't look upon those things as rewards or bribes to be given to them if they yield on something, and they don't look upon them as the withholding of which would be a threat to them. They would like to work it out. And so I believe that just success with this particular nuclear issue, plus the summit meeting, plus the retrieval of remains, those are very good foundations on which to build an alleviation of tension and perhaps even of a substantial opening up of a North Korean society to the outside world.
I'm curious, are you perplexed by China's role in this situation? How do you evaluate Beijing's role?
Well, I think obviously it'd be presumptuous of me to speak for China as it would have been if I had professed to speak for the United States.
From your personal point of view?
I know the Chinese quite well, and I have talks with the Chinese fairly often. The Chinese understood North Korea and its society and its idiosyncrasies, I will say, better than we did, and perhaps better than any other country in the world. When I asked the Korean leader, North Korean leader, what is your relationship with Russia? He said, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And I said, what is your relationship with China? He said, very good. I have serious doubts, and this is a personal, non-official opinion. I have serious doubts that China would ever have approved sanctions against North Korea, because I think they felt that the imposition of sanctions, the embarrassment of Kim Il-sung, the condemnation of that country would have resulted in potential conflict in the region. And of course they had two desires. One is that North Korea not become a nuclear nation with an arsenal of weapons, and the other one was that war should not break out in that region either. And those were the two things they were trying to balance. But I think the Chinese would be quite relieved to see this development.
President Jimmy Carter, we thank you for talking with us immediately after this announcement by President Clinton. Thank you again for being with us from our Atlanta CNN studios. As we say, we talked with President Jimmy Carter immediately after President Clinton announced that talks between the United States and North Korea will resume very soon, in the next few weeks, in Geneva. Those are talks that had broken off in a disagreement over the handling of their nuclear program. He announced that in the meantime, the North Koreans have agreed to freeze their nuclear program. The World Today is next. We'll be right back.
Coming west.